Eastern Front, major theater of combat during World War II that included operations in the Soviet Union, the Balkans, the Baltic states, and Eastern and Central Europe. The principal belligerents were the Soviet Union and Germany. Minor Axis countries included Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. That move ultimately proved as fatal for Adolf Hitler as it had for Napoleon. The German offensive was delivered on June 22, 1941, by 3 army groups under the same commanders as in the 1940 invasion of the West. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was on the right, in southern Poland. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock was in the center, north of the Pripyat marshes. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb was on the left and drove through the Baltic states, but this time the main weight and the decisive role was committed to Bock's army group. 2 armored groups under General Heinz Guderian and General Hermann Hoth were allotted to Bock's front compared with only one under-general, Paul Ludwig von Kleist, to Rundstedt's front. Once again, the operation turned not on the infantry masses, but on the armored forces. These had now been increased from 10 panzer divisions to 19, but only by halving the number of tanks in each division. In total, the Germans allotted almost 150 divisions, containing a total of about 3 million troops, some 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. It was in effect the largest and most powerful invasion force in human history. The plan to launch another great German offensive crystallized in the early months of 1942. By this time, at least 4 million Soviet troops had been killed, wounded, or captured, while German casualties totaled only 1,150,000. Hitler did, however, recognize the limitation of Germany's resources by narrowing the scope of his new offensive. The main effort was to be made on the southern flank near the Black Sea. The tenseness of the situation was manifested in the order to Russian troops to hold on at all costs to the last man. The Red Army had improved significantly since 1942, both in quality and quantity. The flow of new equipment had greatly increased as well as the number of new divisions, and its numerical superiority was now about 4-1.
On November 25, 1941, the German 2nd Panzer Army under Guderian began advancing towards Kashira that lay 120 kilometers south-southeast of Moscow and 80 kilometers north-northeast of Tula. On December 2nd, a reconnaissance battalion came to the town of Khimki, some 19 miles away from the Stalin's Kremlin in central Moscow, reaching its bridge over the Moscow-Volga Canal as well as its railway station. This marked the closest approach of German forces to Moscow. The European winter of 1941-42 was the coldest of the 20th century. General Fedor von Bock claimed in a report to Berlin that the temperature was minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit. This number indicated severely cold conditions, and German troops were freezing with no winter clothing, using equipment that was not designed for such low temperatures. More than 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported among German soldiers. Frozen grease had to be removed from every loaded shell, and vehicles had to be heated for hours before use. The same cold weather hit the Soviet troops, but they were better prepared. German clothing was supplemented by Soviet clothing and boots, which were often in better condition than German clothes as the owners had spent much less time at the front. Stalin transferred over 18 divisions, 1,700 tanks, and over 1,500 aircraft from Siberia and the Far East after learning that Imperial Japan had no plans to invade the USSR in the near future from Richard Sorge. The Red Army had accumulated a 58-division reserve by early December, when the offensive proposed by Zhukov and Vasilevsky was finally approved by Stalin. Even with these new reserves, Soviet forces committed to the operation numbered only 1,100,000 men, only slightly outnumbering the Wehrmacht. Nevertheless, with careful troop deployment, a ratio of 2-to-1 was reached at some critical points. On December 5, 1941, the counteroffensive for removing the immediate threat to Moscow started on the Kalinin Front. The Northwestern Front and Western Fronts began their offensives the next day. After several days of little progress, Soviet armies retook Solnegnogorsk on December 12 and Klin on December 15. Guderian's army beat a hasty retreat towards Vinov and then Sakhinichi. the threat overhanging Tula was removed. On December 8, Hitler had signed his Directive No. 39, ordering the Wehrmacht to assume a defensive stance on the whole front. German troops were unable to organize a solid defense at their initial locations and were forced to pull back to consolidate their lines. Guderian wrote that discussions with Hans Schmidt and Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen took place the same day, and both commanders agreed the current front line could not be held. On December 14th, Halder and Gunther von Kluge finally gave permission for a limited withdrawal to the west of the Oka, without Hitler's approval. On December 20th, during a meeting with German senior officers, Hitler canceled the withdrawal and ordered his soldiers to defend every patch of ground, digging trenches with howitzer shells if needed. Guderian protested, pointing out that losses from cold were actually greater than combat losses and that winter equipment was held up by traffic ties in Poland. Nevertheless, Hitler insisted on defending the existing lines, and Guderian was dismissed by December 25th, along with Generals Hobner and Strauss, commanders of the 4th Panzer and 9th Army, respectively. Bach was also dismissed, officially for medical reasons. Brauchitsch had been removed even earlier, on December 19th. Meanwhile, the Soviet offensive continued in the north.